And, I still really question whether it will be a success. And here's why. The two most powerful forces the human race has ever known are governments and central banks, unfortunately. I would love nothing more than to see Bitcoin or some other decentralized currency of the people succeed wildly. I think it would be the greatest thing ever for freedom and liberty. But I don't know if that's going to happen because the forces against it are extremely powerful.
So I had the privilege of interviewing my good buddy Jason Hartman recently. If you don't know Jason, he talks a lot about real estate. He has a real estate business doing turnkey single family investments, along with other things. He's had a podcast for many, many years that I've actually followed for many years. And he talked about Bitcoin, the future of Bitcoin, doesn't think it's going to make it, why he feels that way. And we had this great panel that I was able to interview him on about inflation and what's happening today. What are the best moves? And he gives his personal own things that he's doing with his own money and recommendations for what is next. So check it out.
Predictions are worth the paper they're written on, maybe. But
I'll write it down.
for whatever it's worth, the government would like us to believe our inflation rate is around 8%. And I think all of us here on the panel, as well as many in the audience, will agree that we anecdotally and empirically from our daily lives know inflation is significantly higher than that. I say it's around 15%. But again, everybody has, of course, their own personal inflation rate depending on their spending patterns. So it varies for everybody. I think some of the inflation, to be fair to Chairman Powell and the others in his camp, some of it is transitory. However, I think there are significant and very real inflationary pressures in the system. In the last year or so, we saw the money supply increase. M2 money supply increased by about 26%. So just logically, we would think as that trickles through the system, inflation would closely track the money supply, right? But of course, it's not the only thing. There are other factors. I think the inflation is going to continue for a few years at least. And it'll be uneven, of course. It affects people differently. It transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the rich. It is a wealth transfer, and I think it's going to continue for a while, for better or worse. As far as the single family, not yet. Of course, there will at some point be a correction. Every market corrects. Every market gets out ahead of itself, out ahead of its skis, so to speak. And then there's a correction and a pullback. There are always market cycles. I mean, the Austrians taught us that, of course, and many others. But I think we're a ways away from that. One of the funny things that I've noticed, and I'm sure Russell can attest to this too, is that people have this kind of unusual linear thinking when it comes to real estate and affordability, housing affordability. And they sort of make these kind of half-baked statements, and I think they believe them too, that are like, well, if interest rates go up and prices are high, then people won't be able to afford a home. Well, what is a home? Please define that for me. The reality of it is that the marketplace is dynamic. And so people out in the marketplace, they're making choices and they're always choosing the best available alternative.
All right, so I'd asked Jason about inflation and affordability. He thinks inflation is around 15%, at least at the time of this video, and that affordability is going down, right? So as interest rates rise, people can afford less of a house because they're paying more in interest rates and their payment is getting much bigger. So in this next section, he talks about TINA, which is an acronym for There Is No Alternative. So he's going to jump into what he thinks is going to happen in the housing market.
We're all familiar with the acronym used in economics and financial circles, TINA, T-I-N-A. And that stands for There Is No Alternative. And it's not really what it says. It says there's no alternative, but what it really means is people choose the best available alternative, okay? And money flows to the best available alternative. So with traditional owner-occupant home buyers, for example, they simply have to accept less. Period. That's it. It's not like they're going to necessarily become homeless or continue to rent. Some of them will. People will make decisions, rent or buy, of course, but they will simply accept less. And this is the insidious thing that inflation does and the whole system does to people. It reduces the standard of living. And so people simply will make trade-offs and they will accept less. I did an example recently in one of my talks at a conference where I picked out a home on Zillow that was for sale in Jacksonville, Florida for $1 million. And then I picked out another home, if you want to call it that, in New York City that was $1 million. And you went from 5,000 square feet in Jacksonville in this gorgeous palatial estate to 653 square feet in New York City, exact same price. Okay, exact same price. So it would be like moving from Jacksonville to New York City. People simply have to accept less. That's the reality of it. You know, you're not going to get 5,000 square feet in New York City for $1 million. You're going to get 653 square feet. And that's what happens with inflation, with the insidious game that the Federal Reserve has played and the government has played on people with this overspending. People just will have to accept less. Now, that won't happen at the elite end of the spectrum because those people are being enriched by this.
So one thing Jason brings up in this part is basically that, you know, you can get a lot more obviously in certain areas. It really highlights the effects of inflation, but also what's happening with population migration. People are moving from New York City to Jacksonville, Florida. We're doing a lot of multifamily apartment investing with our investors in Jacksonville, Florida. We're seeing rents just literally go up 50% just in a very short period of time. It's pretty crazy because all these people are moving, right? So you can have a better quality of life living in a different area. In this next section, he's going to talk about the mechanics of inflation. What is actually happening? He's talking about this wealth transfer, what's actually happening when people they buy things that they really need. You know, used cars right now are actually more expensive than new cars because new cars, a lot of times they don't have the selection that you want. It might take 6 to 12 months or so until you actually get your new car. And then he gets into what he feels is happening with Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies. Very, very interesting section.
But on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, that's exactly what happens. People will get less for rent. They will get less for purchase. They will just have to accept less. And that's the sad reality of it. You know, I think the basic theme of an inflationary environment is that you want to own stuff because stuff has intrinsic value. How do you like that for a complex phrase? Stuff, you know, buy stuff. Yeah.
Put that on a t-shirt.
And you know, but I mean, really think about that incredibly sort of ridiculous simplified statement I made, right? Used cars are more expensive used than new now. I mean, that's an amazing thing, right? Normally a new car would always be more expensive, but the fact that you have materials, you have atoms, right? Stuff has intrinsic value. Paper things have questionable value, right? So if you own stuff, the stuff that especially people need and want, right? That is valuable in inflationary times. And throughout history, we've seen this over and over in Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, in Hungary, in every inflationary example you can think of throughout history. Once people figured it out, they would always take their currency units, and as soon as they got a hold of them from their job, from their pay, they would exchange those currency units for things because things had intrinsic value. So I, of course, like income property. I love single family homes. That's my favorite asset class. But things, right? You know, Brian is really a fan of gold, and gold has been considered money for 5,000 years or so. Okay. These are things that have intrinsic value. They don't need to be debased or attacked by any sort of government or central bank. They are things that people just intrinsically need. So, you know, in times of uncertainty, people store food. And what they're really doing is maybe not planning for the end of the world. They're simply hedging food inflation costs, right? By buying food in advance before the price increases. And so own stuff. That is the most simple advice I can give. Stuff matters, as long as it's hopefully not depreciating stuff and it's stuff that people need. And everybody in the world needs housing. And the ingredients of those houses, the copper wire, the concrete, the steel, the glass, the lumber, of course, we've heard a lot about lumber over the past year, the energy, the petroleum products, every ingredient of a house are commodities that are traded around the world, not attached to any one specific currency. I don't even want to say the words, but you know what I'm talking about. So it's look, when I originally learned about Bitcoin, that was probably 10 years ago or so. It was $74 per coin, and I just didn't get it for a long time, and I didn't believe it for a long time, and I still really question whether it will be a success. And here's why. The two most powerful forces the human race has ever known are governments and central banks, unfortunately. I would love nothing more than to see Bitcoin or some other decentralized currency of the people succeed wildly. I think it would be the greatest thing ever for freedom and liberty. But I don't know if that's going to happen because the forces against it are extremely powerful. Now, when it comes to cryptocurrencies, of course, the ones that will take off right away will be the ones forced upon the people. That'll be a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency, whatever it's going to be called. But that will be a success in quotes because it will be forced upon people. And it will probably be ushered in on the heels of a problem with cryptocurrency. Maybe that'll be engineered. Maybe it'll be a false flag. We don't know. They will have to do something to protect us, as they always want to do, supposedly. And we'll see what happens. But I think a central bank digital currency is a extremely scary thing. Because one of the very important liberties people need to be free is the freedom to spend, and the freedom to spend the way they want and to spend privately, so that it cannot be tracked. That is a really important civil right, and a central bank digital currency will end that civil right. I've always said years ago, before cryptocurrencies, I always said that when there is a global fiat currency, it will be checkmate upon humanity. But a central bank digital currency that has the power of a computer network behind it will be even worse, because they can put restrictions on it. They can inflate away your money. They can force you to spend it within 30 days of receiving it. It'll probably be ushered in with a universal basic income or some kind of stimulus. And they can say the money doesn't work.
So you can see Jason gets into why he thinks really the two most powerful forces right now are central bankers and governments. And that with central bank digital currency, they might make it very difficult to use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, which I think is a really great observation, and it's something that anybody who owns any crypto should be aware of. I have some crypto off an exchange, some Bitcoin off an exchange, but I'm also aware that it may be difficult at some point to access it in the future. But really, the right and the privacy of owning money is that you actually can spend money without the government knowing what you're spending on, which to me feels like a pretty fundamental right, which is what Jason talks about. Now he gets into his specific recommendations on what he thinks you should consider doing in your investing.
More than 1 mile from your home, or after 10 p.m. at night, or before 8 a.m. in the morning. I mean, what they can do is endless, the way they can restrict freedoms. So it's extremely dire that we make sure that doesn't happen, because spending is a really important civil right, and the ability to spend freely and privately. You know, the first thing I thought of when I read about Putin demanding rubles for oil is I thought, Putin is basically invoking modern monetary theory. He's increasing the demand for his own currency. And I thought that was a pretty brilliant move. I mean, I think it's a terrible move that he invaded Ukraine in the first place. It's absolutely horrific what's happened, but that was a pretty smart move on the part of the ruble thing. I mean, you guys agree with that, right? I'm guessing on his part. But I just don't buy into this theory about China being as big a deal as everybody's making. I mean, what they've done is obviously incredible over the last 30 years. But, in 10 years, China has a demographic time bomb that is going to start exploding. And after 10 years from now, it is going to just get worse and worse and worse for them. Russia is a dying country. I mean, the old saying, demographics is destiny, right? And that almost every competitor, if you will, of the U.S., every major competitor has giant demographic problems. I mean, Western Europe is a dying continent. Russia's a dying country. Japan's a dying country. And China will be a dying country soon. If you don't have kids, you can't have a country. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And one of my podcast listeners and friends did an interesting study in one city looking at all of the Airbnb units available and the what if scenario if those properties were to come up for sale. So, we've got to remember something about the Airbnb thing. Airbnb is a baby. It's really only been around prominently for about 12 years. I mean, it was there a little bit before that, but it was nothing. And it's interesting. The population has increased a bit, but during that time, but not that much. And more hotels have been built. I mean, the number of beds outside of someone's primary residence has increased quite dramatically. Look at all these mattress companies. They're popping up out of the woodwork, right? You got Casper and Tuft and Needle, and I mean, whatever happened to Beauty Rest and all those Simmons and all the old ones, right? So there's a lot of beds available around the world, and I think there's a lot of extra supply. And if the economy goes into a major recession, or when it does, the first thing people cut out is travel and vacations. That's not a necessity. Now, some of the Airbnb market is for people like traveling nurses and, people on job assignments and so forth. I get it. But it just seems like there's a potential for a real oversupply issue here. It's hard to measure, but that's just my feeling anecdotally.
All right, so he gives his recommendations here, and I think it's really awesome. I've had some friends that are just absolutely killing it in Airbnb, buying a house, renting it out, as a rental, as a short-term rental. There are certain markets that are very favorable to this. I have a friend that just did this in the Orlando area. Is just probably planning to just absolutely do 10 times better than just owning a long-term rental house there. One thing to consider when you do own Airbnbs, you have to consider the local jurisdiction that you're in. In California, where I live, it's much more difficult. There's much more limits. They can regulate if your neighbors complain. They can actually stop you or not issue a permit to continue your Airbnb. So that can be very difficult, but it is something to consider. And then he talks about, you heard it here first, mattresses, getting into mattress companies. Now, Casper, he mentioned, they actually had some financial trouble for a while. They actually went private. You can see here on this article. But basically there's a lot more stuff being shipped to people's houses. People are more concerned, obviously, about how they sleep, and obviously, stores. People are not going into Sleep Number or maybe shopping centers as much to buy mattresses. So that has been a company or an industry that's really been very disrupted. So anyway, with all of this, one thing we do when it comes to inflation, when it comes to really hedging against the changing monetary environment, as we do multifamily apartment investing. We've got about $200 million in multifamily assets. We work with retail investors to help invest money passively and to get great returns and tax benefits through multifamily investing. So you can check that out, bronsonequity.com. You can check it out, the link below. We have a free report called The Single Best Investing Strategy During and After a Pandemic. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to see any feedback that you have in the comments. Anybody else you'd like me to talk with and be able to get, to ask questions as far as inflation, as far as crypto, real estate, things related to economic matters. So thanks for taking the time to educate yourself. Look forward to seeing you on the next video.